What if the most powerful family in Europe was also the most cursed? What if centuries of power, pride, and faith were enough to destroy not only a dynasty, but the human bodies that carried its name? They called themselves chosen by God, but their true enemy was their own blood. For 600 years, the House of Habsburg ruled kings, queens, and emperors. Their palaces stretched from Spain to Austria, their bloodline woven into every throne in Europe. But behind the golden crowns and the sacred marriages, a secret was growing. A disease not born from plague or sin, but from love itself. And it would end with a king whose body was so twisted, so broken, that his own doctors called him a miracle that he could live at all. Bell toll, slow cinematic fade. Welcome to Creepshadow, where history hides its darkest truths, and the past never truly dies.
It began, as many tragedies do, with pride disguised as love. For centuries the Habsburgs ruled half of Europe: Spain, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Netherlands. Their empire was so vast that the sun, they said, never set upon it. They saw themselves not just as kings and queens, but as chosen beings, God's instruments on earth. And so they decided to keep the divine blood pure. But purity is a dangerous illusion. In their quest to protect their lineage, the Habsburgs began to marry within their own family, cousins, uncles, nieces. They called it dynastic preservation, but what they were really doing was building a genetic trap. Each union tightened the circle a little more. Each generation brought the same names, the same faces, the same flaws. At first, the results were subtle: a slightly longer chin, a heavier jaw, eyes that didn't quite align. But with time, those signs multiplied until their portraits became mirrors of decay. The royal painters tried to hide it, of course. They painted idealized versions of their masters, graceful, divine, perfect. But the truth was too persistent to erase with a brushstroke. Because every royal feast, every marriage ceremony, every new birth was also an act of self-destruction. Behind the marble walls of the Habsburg palaces, a silent disease was spreading, invisible, hereditary, merciless. They were surrounded by gold, power, and faith, yet they could not escape their own reflection. The courtiers whispered of divine punishment. The priests insisted it was God's test. The doctors said nothing, because they dared not.
They knew what was happening. They had seen it in the children. Babies born too small, too weak, too strange. Infants that struggled to breathe, that could not swallow, that died before their first winter. And those who lived, lived in pain. The Habsburg jaw became their symbol, their curse. The lower jaw jutted forward, grotesquely extended. The lips could not close. Speaking and eating became difficult. The very faces that adorned coins and banners across Europe had become monuments to suffering. And still, they refused to stop. Because to the Habsburgs, blood was not just life, it was power. To marry outside the family meant sharing that power, diluting it. And in the cruel logic of royalty, it was better to destroy themselves than to surrender control. A cycle had begun, a pattern repeated over and over, generation after generation, until the family tree was no longer a tree at all, but a noose tightening around their own necks. By the 1500s, the effects were undeniable. The Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg dynasty were practically one family. Their ancestors' names repeated like an incantation: Philip, Charles, Ferdinand, Margaret, the same bloodlines looping endlessly in a dance with death. And then came Charles II of Spain, the final heir, the end of the bloodline. From the moment of his birth in 1661, it was clear something was terribly wrong. His body was frail and distorted, his tongue so large he could barely speak. He could not chew, and much of his food had to be mashed and spoon-fed to him like an infant. His limbs trembled uncontrollably. He suffered seizures, nosebleeds, and hallucinations. He was deaf in one ear, nearly blind in one eye, and though he lived to adulthood, his mind remained childlike, trapped somewhere between innocence and agony. The royal doctors called him a miracle that he could live at all. The priests called him bewitched. But the truth was far simpler and far crueler. Charles II was the product of 2 centuries of inbreeding. He was the mathematical conclusion of royal arrogance. Modern geneticists have analyzed his lineage, and what they found is staggering. Charles's inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. That means that after hundreds of years of cousin marriages, his genetic code was collapsing in on itself, a spiral of errors, mutations, and inherited diseases all wrapped inside one body. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was both his aunt and cousin by blood. His father, Philip IV, was the son and nephew of Habsburg siblings. It was not marriage, it was replication, generation after generation of the same genetic echo. By the time Charles was born, the empire itself had begun to mirror his body, powerful in appearance, yet hollow within. Spain's armies faltered, its economy withered, its colonies rebelled. The divine empire was bleeding from every vein, and at its head sat a dying boy with the face of a dynasty and the body of its curse. They said he was bewitched. They blamed witches, curses, the devil himself. But the real curse was written in numbers, not magic. Every chromosome told the same story, that power without wisdom becomes self-destruction. The Habsburgs had feared contamination from the outside world, but the infection came from within, from their own obsession, their own pride, their own belief that they were untouchable. And so the family that had ruled the world was undone not by rebellion or conquest, but by the very thing they worshipped, their blood. He was born a king, but his crown was a genetic tombstone. And the world would soon watch as the last of the Habsburgs fulfilled the prophecy written in his bones. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched One. But the truth is, Charles II of Spain didn't need witches to curse him. He was born under one. From the moment of his birth in 1661, the midwives knew something was wrong. The infant didn't cry. He didn't move. He was so small and fragile that even the priest hesitated before baptizing him, fearing that the touch of holy water might be too much. He was baptized immediately because no one believed he would live through the night. But he did. He lived through the night, the week, the month, and miraculously, the years. A living contradiction. A king who wasn't supposed to survive, ruling an empire that was already dying. As a child, Charles could barely walk. His legs twisted inward. His head was so large that servants had to hold it upright when he sat on the throne for ceremonies. His jaw jutted forward so severely that he could not close his mouth completely. He drooled constantly and could barely chew his food. For most of his meals, his servants mashed it into liquid and spoon-fed him like a child. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4. He couldn't read until he was 10. And even as an adult, he often spoke like a child. The court tried to hide his disabilities from the world. Every portrait was carefully crafted to disguise his deformities. His eyes were softened, his jaw refined, his stature dignified. But in private, those closest to him knew the truth. The King of Spain could barely function on his own. And yet, he ruled an empire. Spain, once the most powerful kingdom in the world, was now a hollow shell. Its colonies in the Americas were rebelling. Its treasury was empty. Its armies were starving. And the man sitting on the throne, the supposed descendant of divine kings, was a ghost in human form. The court was not a place of leadership anymore, but of manipulation. Behind the king's frail body stood 1,000 hungry hands. Nobles, priests, generals, all whispering, all plotting, all using the boy king as a puppet for their own gain. His mother, Mariana of Austria, ruled in his name for years, but even she was terrified of him, not as a ruler, but as a symbol. Because to look at Charles was to see the truth that everyone in the Habsburg line had been denying for centuries. He was not a miracle. He was a warning. Whispers filled the palace. Why was the king so sickly? Why did he tremble when he prayed? Why did his eyes roll back when the priest blessed him? The church had an answer: witchcraft. They said the boy had been cursed at birth by those who envied the Habsburgs' power. They said demons whispered in his ear as he slept, that his body was not weak, it was possessed. Exorcisms were performed in secret chambers. Priests sprinkled holy water on his food. They made him wear relics of saints around his neck and burned incense in his rooms to cleanse the evil spirits. But none of it worked, because the curse wasn't spiritual, it was genetic. Every bone, every cell, every heartbeat inside Charles II was a prayer written in broken code. As he grew older, his mind began to deteriorate further. He suffered from hallucinations. He would wake in the night screaming that shadows were whispering his name. He believed he was being poisoned, and, in a way, he was, by his own DNA. His body failed him piece by piece. His teeth rotted. His skin grew pale and thin. His hands trembled so violently that he couldn't hold the royal seal. His speech slurred, his sight dimmed, and his thoughts wandered into delirium. But his greatest torment was his failure to produce an heir. 2 marriages and not a single child. The royal physicians blamed demons. The church blamed witchcraft. The truth was far simpler. Charles was sterile. His reproductive organs were malformed, another symptom of the genetic decay that had plagued the Habsburg bloodline for generations. Desperate for answers, Charles ordered the unthinkable. In 1698, he summoned the Inquisition, not to judge heretics, but to investigate his own curse. He demanded they find out who had bewitched him. The priests obeyed. They interrogated servants, nobles, even nuns. Dozens were accused of casting spells upon the king. They burned candles, recited exorcisms, and even performed necromantic rituals to trace the witch who had cursed him. After months of this madness, the Inquisition returned with an answer. They claimed they had discovered the culprit, not a person, but a corpse. The body of a long-dead monk, they said, had been hidden beneath the royal bedchamber. Its bones had been used in a satanic ritual to curse the king's blood. They burned the remains, they chanted prayers for days, and still nothing changed. Because the curse had never been buried in the ground, it was buried in the royal veins. By the year 1699, Charles was a ghost of himself. He could barely move, he drooled constantly. His hair fell out in clumps, his skin turned gray. He spent his final months in a fog of pain and confusion, believing he was already dead, but his body refused to accept it. His doctors, desperate to understand the phenomenon, wrote secret notes. They said his body was anatomically inconsistent with life. When he finally died in 1700, at the age of 38, they performed an autopsy. What they found horrified them. His body was filled with fluid, his lungs rotted, his intestines were black. He only had one shrunken testicle, described as the size of a bean, and his heart, the symbol of divine kingship, was twice the normal size, but soft, like wax left too long in the sun. The doctors wrote that his body was a miracle of decay, and in that moment, the dynasty of the Habsburgs, the most powerful bloodline in Europe, ended. The people mourned, but not for the man, for the myth. For centuries they had believed that royal blood was sacred, that power could be inherited like gold. But Charles's death revealed the truth. His entire family had been building a temple to themselves, and their own bodies became the altar of sacrifice. The Habsburgs had not been destroyed by war, rebellion, or disease. They had been destroyed by their own design. In the silence that followed his death, the priests finally stopped whispering about witches, the doctor stopped lying, and the empire stopped breathing. The Habsburg line of Spain was gone, extinguished, a dynasty that had ruled half the world, undone by a single genetic truth, that no blood is divine, only human. He was born a king, but his body was never his own. He carried 6 centuries of sin in his veins, and when he died, so did the illusion of royal perfection. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661 into a family that had already begun to rot from within. For centuries, the Habsburg dynasty had believed that its blood was sacred, chosen by God to rule. They guarded that blood with pride, refusing to mix it with outsiders. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The same names, the same faces, the same blood, repeated generation after generation, until their family tree no longer branched. It circled back on itself. When Charles was born, that circle finally closed. From his first breath, he was marked by the curse of his ancestors. The infant was frail, silent, and barely alive. The midwives whispered prayers, convinced he would not survive the night. His body was too weak, his skin too pale, his breathing shallow and irregular. He was baptized immediately, because even the priests did not expect him to live long enough to earn a name. But he did live. He clung to life with a stubbornness that defied his own body, and that stubbornness would define him for the rest of his days. The people called it a miracle. In truth, it was a tragedy stretched across 38 years. As a child, Charles could barely hold his head upright.
His bones were soft and twisted. His legs curved inward, forcing servants to carry him for most of his early life. His head was abnormally large, and his jaw jutted so far forward that he could not close his mouth completely. He drooled constantly and struggled to chew food. For most meals, servants mashed his food into a paste so he could swallow it without choking. He spoke rarely and with difficulty, and his words came out slurred, as if trapped somewhere between his brain and his tongue. He didn't learn to speak properly until he was 4 years old. He didn't learn to read until he was 10, and even then, the words meant little to him. The courtiers and painters did everything they could to hide his deformities. Every official portrait of Charles was an act of fiction. The painters softened the jawline, reshaped the eyes, erased the drool, and brightened his skin. They painted not the king as he was, but as Spain wanted him to be. But beneath the gold and canvas, the truth was terrifying. The King of Spain, the ruler of one of the largest empires in history, was physically and mentally crippled. He was a living symbol of genetic decay, a breathing monument to the arrogance of a family that had defied nature for too long.
The empire around him was decaying as well. Spain, once rich and unstoppable, was now hollow. Its colonies were in rebellion. Its economy was collapsing. Its soldiers were unpaid and starving. The throne sat heavy with centuries of divine authority, but the man sitting on it was a shadow. Behind the sickly king, the court became a nest of manipulation. Nobles, generals, and priests competed for control over him. His mother, Mariana of Austria, ruled in his name for years, but even she was haunted by his existence. To look at her son was to see the family sin made flesh. She had married her own uncle. She had given birth to a boy who carried every flaw, every mutation, every ghost of the Habsburg line inside him. People began to whisper that the king was cursed, that no human body could be so afflicted without the touch of the devil. When Charles's health worsened, the church declared that witches had placed a hex upon him at birth. Exorcisms were performed in secret rooms. Holy water was sprinkled over his meals. Priests filled his chambers with incense and relics, chanting prayers to drive out unseen demons. But the true demon was written in his DNA, not in the air. No ritual could cleanse a curse that had been inherited. As he grew older, his condition deteriorated further. He suffered constant seizures and fainting spells. His vision blurred, his teeth rotted, and his skin grew gray and translucent. He was often too weak to stand, too weak to speak, too weak to rule. His thoughts wandered into delusion. He believed that invisible forces were trying to poison him. He would wake in the night screaming that shadows whispered his name. The priests saw this as proof of demonic possession. The doctors saw it as proof of madness, but the truth was much simpler. His body was failing from the inside out. By his late 30s, Charles II was barely human. He could no longer walk without help. His face was sunken, his teeth black, his hair came out in clumps. He drooled constantly, and his speech had turned to incomprehensible murmurs. He would sit for hours in silence, staring at nothing, convinced that he was already dead and that his body simply refused to admit it. His servants often found him in bed, whispering to the saints, begging them to let him die. The royal doctors recorded every detail in their journals. They wrote that his body was anatomically inconsistent with life. When he finally died in 1700, at only 38 years old, the royal physicians performed an autopsy. What they found shocked them. His lungs were black and swollen. His intestines were rotting. His body was filled with fluid. His heart was enormous but soft, like wax melting in a flame.
His genitals were shriveled and deformed. He had one small testicle and was completely sterile. The doctors wrote that he was a wonder that he could live so long. The death of Charles II marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. For centuries, they had ruled continents, commanded armies, and built an empire that spanned the world. But their power had been built on a delusion, that divine blood was untouchable. In reality, their sacred lineage had become a genetic tomb. The same blood they worshipped had turned toxic. Every generation had poured from the same poisoned cup, and Charles was the last to drink. When he died, the illusion of royal perfection died with him. Across Europe, people mourned the end of an empire, but few understood what had truly happened. They blamed witches, fate, and sin. But science, centuries later, would reveal the truth. The downfall of the Habsburgs was not the work of demons or destiny. It was the result of a mathematical law. Too much similarity, too little variation. Nature punishing arrogance the only way it knows, by ensuring that what cannot change cannot survive. Charles II was not bewitched. He was born under the weight of 1,000 years of pride, trapped inside a body that could no longer bear the name it carried. His reign ended with silence. His bloodline ended with him, and the empire that once claimed divine favor became a warning carved into the pages of history, a reminder that even kings cannot escape their own humanity. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661 into a dynasty that had been poisoning itself for generations. The Habsburgs believed their blood was sacred, chosen by God to rule. They guarded it with pride, marrying within their own family for centuries. But their obsession with purity became their curse. By the time Charles was born, the royal bloodline was so entangled that his parents were both uncle and niece. He was not the heir to greatness, he was the final result of centuries of genetic decay. The newborn was small, pale, and silent. He didn't cry, he barely moved. The priests baptized him immediately, certain he would not live through the night. But he did, and that fragile survival was mistaken for divine favor. In truth, it was the beginning of a slow, living death. As a child, Charles was weak and disfigured. His head was large, his jaw jutted forward so far he couldn't close his mouth, and he drooled constantly. He learned to speak late, read late, and never truly matured. Servants spoon-fed him mashed food because he couldn't chew. Painters softened his portraits to hide the deformities, turning the sickly king into an illusion of dignity. But in reality, he was barely capable of ruling. Spain, once an empire of gold and glory, had begun to crumble. Behind the throne, powerful nobles and priests controlled every decision, using the broken king as a puppet. His mother, Mariana of Austria, ruled in his name for years. Even she saw her son as a divine punishment, the living proof of the Habsburg sin. When Charles's health worsened, the church claimed he had been bewitched. Priests filled his chambers with relics, holy water, and incense. Exorcisms were performed in secret. But the real curse wasn't in his soul, it was in his genes. His body trembled, his mind faltered, and his thoughts turned to madness. He believed shadows whispered his name at night. He thought demons had stolen his strength. He was sterile, unable to produce an heir, his body too malformed to continue the bloodline. In desperation, he summoned the Inquisition to find the source of his curse. After months of investigation, the priests claimed that a corpse buried beneath the royal palace had been used in a satanic ritual to hex the king. They burned the bones, prayed for days, and nothing changed. Charles continued to waste away, trapped inside his failing body. When he finally died in 1700, at only 38 years old, doctors found his body anatomically inconsistent with life. His lungs were rotted, his organs deformed, his heart swollen and soft like wax. He was the final echo of his dynasty, a man born not to rule, but to die slowly for the sins of his ancestors. The death of Charles II ended the Spanish Habsburg line. The empire that once ruled the world collapsed under the weight of its own pride. The blood they called divine had become poison. And through Charles, history learned a cruel truth, that no crown can protect a man from the curse written in his own flesh.
When Charles II of Spain died in 1700, the world witnessed not just the death of a man, but the collapse of an empire. The Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty, once the most powerful family on earth, was gone. For centuries they had ruled continents, commanded armies, and baptized their blood as sacred. But their greatest strength had become their curse. The purity they protected so fiercely had destroyed them from within. Europe trembled in the aftermath. Without an heir, Spain faced chaos. Every royal house in Europe saw opportunity in the corpse of a dead king. The War of Spanish Succession erupted, nations tearing at each other to claim the throne Charles had left empty. France, Austria, Britain, and the Dutch all fought for control, while Spain itself bled under foreign banners. What Charles could not say in life, his death screamed in silence. Power built on corruption does not endure. The decline of the Habsburgs was not sudden. It had been unfolding for centuries, slow and inevitable. As their blood thinned, so too did their wisdom. They had believed themselves chosen by God, yet they ignored the natural laws that govern every living thing. The Habsburg jaw, the sickness, the madness, these were not punishments from heaven. They were consequences of arrogance, the price of believing that divine right could defy biology. In the decades that followed, physicians and historians studied the Habsburg bloodline in horror. They saw inbreeding not as sin or witchcraft, but as mathematics, a fatal equation that doubled its errors with each generation. The same faces repeated across portraits, the same features growing more distorted. What began as a royal strategy ended as a biological collapse. By the 18th century, the family that had ruled half the world had become a warning whispered in classrooms and laboratories. Purity is not strength, it is extinction. In Spain, the people mourned their king, but deep down they knew his death was mercy. For years they had watched a monarch too weak to stand, too frail to think, too broken to live. The court painters who once glorified him now painted darker tones, not of triumph, but of mourning. The golden light of empire had dimmed into gray. Centuries later, modern science would uncover what faith and fear could not. Genetic studies confirmed what nature had long revealed. Charles II was one of the most inbred men in recorded history. His inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of a child born from a brother and sister. The empire had fallen, not by rebellion or invasion, but by the slow decay of its own design. The Habsburgs had sought to preserve their divine essence. Instead, they proved that no dynasty, no crown, no bloodline, no matter how powerful, can escape the truth written in flesh. The death of Charles II was not just the end of a family, it was nature reclaiming its balance. And in that silence, history left behind its most haunting reminder. What humanity builds in arrogance, time will always destroy in mercy.